So if I may start with you, David. You talked about, I was trying to count how many times you mentioned oil markets, and you did quite a few times. What exactly you mean by market? Is it really all oil markets? Because when we look at it from India, a major importer, we find sometimes crude prices are going up for no reason, and sometimes they are coming down for no reason. And we see that OPEC is meeting, and before that prices start already going up. So where is the market? Who drives these markets? Is there a deep state within the oil markets? If there is a deep state, where exactly the deep state is parked?
So on the deep state, I think you've got a much greater expert on deep states than me. I'm going to speak later, so you can ask him. He's shaking his head. Apparently, you're not going to hear about the deep state. It could be that the deep state has got to him, and now he has to deny it. So let me be very clear what I mean by oil markets, or markets generally, because I think I may have said the word oil market, but my point was really about markets more generally. And by that, what I mean is a mechanism for discovering the costs of providing supply and for allowing people to transact at a price that both buyer and seller willingly enter into. And that actually applies pretty well in the global oil market. And wholesale markets in oil, to an extent in gas, and to an even slightly lesser extent in electricity, exist all over the world. That's not where the problem comes. It's exposing the ultimate consumer to the market that matters. And that's where I use the example of Argentina and India maybe following in terms of natural gas. But if you go back 20 years in India, the issue was that natural gas imports were much too expensive, that sellers just couldn't demand such high prices, and therefore India was going to refuse to import natural gas. And even in one or two cases where it had agreed to import natural gas, it decided with the benefit of hindsight that that price was too high, and it demanded that the price come down because it just said it couldn't afford that price. At the same time, it offered a much lower price to domestic producers. And if I think about Argentina, where that happened to extreme, where the gas price for domestic producers was $1, maybe $2 per thousand BTU, per million BTUs, and the imported price was $5, $6, in some cases $10 or $12 per MMBTU, and they didn't expose consumers to the marginal price of gas, they blended it to create gas that was $1.20. When there's 5% imports or when there's 10% imports, you can do that, have average cost pricing. But eventually, demand runs away because the consumer isn't exposed to the market price, and it becomes more and more expensive until you can't any longer afford to be importing gas. And you can't find an elegant mechanism for incentivizing domestic producers. So in Argentina, they've got huge gas resources, but no one wants to develop them at that time because it wasn't cost effective to do so. And yet for half what you were paying for imported gas, you could have been developing domestic gas. India has been in exactly the same position. It's got a lot of gas resources that aren't being developed because the government was saying the price should be X rather than saying let's find the price. I know there are a lot of gas buyers.
But sorry, I'll keep you interrupting. Yeah. You see, the point is that, if it's only market, it's all about markets, then why don't they dismantle OPEC? Why do you need OPEC? And as long as there is OPEC, if something goes wrong or things don't go in our favor, a major importer, of course the government is going to say things, people are going to say things.
Look, you can say anything you like, and they do. I mean, now in 144 or 288 characters. But the point is not what governments say, it's when they say, take gas consumers in Gujarat, around the Hazira Peninsula. There are people who would have willingly bought gas at the price that they could have imported it, but they were told, no, you can't import that gas because we don't want to establish a price that we don't think is fair to pay. So it's not what they said, it's what they did. It's that they prevented the market from working, prevented it from clearing. Now, I think that OPEC is in a sense raising it in the context of markets is a red herring, because OPEC is just another player in the global oil market. OPEC doesn't set the price, or at least if OPEC does set the price, it does a remarkably bad job of doing it, because if they were really good at setting the price, it would stay pretty constant. But you have these wild swings because the market, if the price is too high, supply expands and demand...
Just a minute. You said OPEC doesn't set the price.
I said doesn't set the price.
Does not.
No.
No?
No, the market sets the price.
Markets, not OPEC.
I mean...
All right. Just a second. How many friends in the room think that OPEC actually doesn't set the price? Please, those who think that OPEC has no role in terms of,
Hang on. No, that's a different question. No, that's a different question. Does OPEC have a role? Yeah, in the same way as Shell has a role.
I use your sentence. OPEC doesn't set the price. How many people in the room agree with David?
So can I clarify your question? How many of you think that OPEC is the only person who sets the price, so that the price of oil is what OPEC says it should be?
David, that's a different question.
No, because OPEC influences. No, OPEC influences. OPEC influences.
No, you see, you said OPEC doesn't set the price.
Yes.
And I asked this question to the House here, and only 2 hands have gone up. India's former ambassador to Saudi Arabia and Dr. Sharma, who is an expert. So, accept the 2 hands, very learned hands.
I think your former ambassador is also an expert. I'm sure you didn't mean to...
Okay, let me ask Jaran. You agree with him?
I think just now, for the last 4 months, we have been in a regulated market. So we are back to actually OPEC controlling the market. I think one really important thing that has happened is that Russia has joined the club. You know, it's almost cozy to be in Wien these days at the OPEC meeting, because Russia is really close to the club, and they have together with Saudi Arabia increased production with more than 600,000 barrels since June to compensate for the Venezuela and the Iran shortfall. Which is the reason why the oil price is only $80 as we speak. It should be higher, actually. So I think we are in a situation now back to a regulated market. And if you really study the history of oil, we have had periods with regulated markets and periods without. So, for example, in 2005, even if OPEC would, they couldn't increase the production more. And then, actually, in one way, it went out of control. And as we know, the oil price went all the way up to $140. And also the struggle to have control in 2012 and 13. And then, of course, we got the shale revolution and things collapsed, and then they couldn't have control the other way, actually. But just now, I think that we are reaching a new equilibrium. So I expect, actually, that I briefly mentioned, that we will see some softening of the natural price cycle that is in the market. You know, actually, with shale, some people think that shale will smooth out the cycles. But both the experience from the market, but also over mathematical modeling, is actually showing that shale is exaggerating the cycles. So the cycles will be shorter and more volatile with shale than without shale. So it's more important now to also have some countries softening the cycle, which could be the combination of really the core OPEC, which is basically the 5 countries in the Gulf, together with Russia. And they can react within 3 to 6 months with 1 million barrels, quite immediate response. They will actually be able to soften the cycles.
But let me ask one question. If you go to the street here in Delhi and ask the ordinary consumer, he says, I'm bleeding thanks to OPEC. Not or market, they say thanks to OPEC. Now, that's the perception I'm talking about. So what actually has changed the last 3 months? The prices suddenly are going only in one direction, that's north.
You have a quite devastating currency effect for quite some consuming countries globally. You know, not only India, also Turkey and some others are now really seeing a very high oil price from their local currency. So it's very understandable, the situation. I mean, from a set of complex reasons, you know, the US dollar is very strong at the moment. And so that is actually influencing the prices in the local markets, making the oil price now higher than it was when it was $110 in 2012, actually.
In local currency.
in the local currency, of course. So, and the action that OPEC is taking is actually dampening the price increase. So I think rather the consumer at the street should say, thanks to OPEC, we don't see even a much higher price. Because, and then of course, thanks to America, Iran is not able to find a market for their oil. So that's maybe a more relevant kind of place to put their critical
No, but
comments.
David, if I may go back to you. If you look at optics, it seems that Saudi Arabia and the US are like brothers in arms. But when you look at oil and OPEC, it seems that Saudi Arabia and Russia, they're almost married to each other. I mean, what exactly is going on?
Well, I think let me start by talking about Russia. Russia has managed to occupy a political vacuum in the Middle East that means that Russia is the only country that is on speaking terms with Israel, with Saudi Arabia, with Iran, with Syria, with Yemen. How they've managed to achieve that is both a tribute to Russian foreign policy and probably the withdrawalist tendency of America squandering 70 to 100 years of political capital in the region. But I think that it's possible to be friends in some domains and rivals in other domains. So I'm not particularly surprised that should be the case. But I would also say that if you think about oil markets, I just want to come back to and reinforce the point Jared made, which is that the oil price, if it hadn't been for OPEC in 2005 to 2007, pumping as much as it could possibly pump, the price might well have been $300 a barrel. That when steel prices are high, steel producers typically have higher run rates in their furnaces. When steel prices are low, they typically shut down furnaces. We don't say that they are setting the price. What we say is they are responding to market conditions. If you were to ask people in the street 10 years ago who's responsible for the price of oil, they'd probably have said it was the government. Was it 10 years ago that you reduced the subsidy on oil? So they'd have said it's the government because they had no idea what the world oil price was. What they saw was what came passed through. Now they might well say it's oil producers, and OPEC is an easy acronym to pronounce in any language, and it's an easy target to point at. But really, the OPEC members, firstly, if they were setting the price, it wouldn't be as volatile. What they're doing is they are looking to ameliorate the price. OPEC has always said our goal is to bring stability to the oil market. It doesn't help us if the price is too high. It doesn't help us if the price is too low.
David, just a second. A hypothetical question to both of you, the same question. Norway is not OPEC, but you know OPEC very well. You're always there. You're an
We
observer.
have joined them at
You've joined them.
occasions.
Yeah, not yet.
Yeah.
But tell me that, if, for instance, big importers like India, China, Japan, Korea, they join hands, they join forces and try to build a platform of oil importing countries, oil, petroleum, OPEC or whatever it is called. Ambassador Talmiz Ahmed is here, he was very much involved in such efforts. Do you think that, if they were to join forces and try to build something, you think it would have any impact? Or you think it would be just creating another bureaucracy with some conferences and seminar but no results?
Yeah, honestly, I think that the risk would be that it actually would exaggerate the cycles again. To try to regulate prices, you mean to be tough in the negotiations, but then the prices will be lowered, the infill drilling will be reduced, and then suddenly you're short of oil, and the market is back with a stronger momentum, because you really need the oil. It's a quite inelastic product when you have the consumption technology there. So the elasticity is only on a very long term, 5 to 10 years. Like in the 70s, the high prices made people switch to nuclear power. That came in the 80s, so it was a kind of 10 years lag. But of course, and that will happen now, and that is actually a problem for OPEC. If the oil price goes up to above $100 in the early 2020s, then that will really boost electric vehicles and then destroy the market longer term. So that's also one reason I think that they don't want to kind of see the prices go too high. But any kind of regulated market prices like we have seen for gas in many countries is basically just taking away the supply and leading to higher prices long term.
But if this organization I'm talking about hypothetically is headquartered in Riyadh, would that make any difference?
I mean, I think Riyadh is a lovely place to live. I've lived there for 6 years. I'm not totally in love with the driving habits, but then I come to India and I remind myself how good it is in Riyadh, because at least the traffic is moving in Riyadh, even if not necessarily always in a straight line. But if it wouldn't matter where you put it, it wouldn't matter whether you create it or not. It would be no more effective at regulating the price of oil than OPEC is as a group of producers cooperating. As Göran says, it would probably introduce greater volatility because nothing is less transparent and provides certainty than politicians deciding what they think the answer ought to be rather than letting, I mean, there's a reason why liberalized free markets do price discovery and find lower prices of products than government-regulated entities. That debate was over 20, 30 years ago.
Two last questions. First question is that I'm not a good reader of faces, but it seems you both seems to be happy that oil prices are going up. Are you?
When I arrived in Riyadh, I have an FJ Cruiser, fantastic car. It used to cost me less than 100 riyals to fill the tank, so less than $30. And that tank would have allowed me to drive from Riyadh to Abu Dhabi on one tank. Now I go to fill up and it's costing me $100 to fill that same tank.
So you're not happy?
So I'm not completely happy, but I also recognize that oil is a fantastic deal. What would it cost me if instead? There is so much consumer surplus in oil. I'm indifferent really to high or low oil prices because I'm a think tank analyst.
Göran?
Actually, I drive electric cars. You know, like everyone in my neighborhood, I think Oslo is the biggest natural experiment with electric cars. That in combination with city tax for gasoline cars, entrance tax, if you come with a car, but nothing for electric cars, has actually made the local gasoline station is down 10% year over year in oil sales. So I think this is the first really evidence of EVs influencing the market. So this is probably 10, 15, 20 years ahead of the rest of the market, but this will eventually happen because basically it's a much better vehicle, actually. It's faster, it's silent, it's no pollution, everything. So it will take the global market, but it will take a lot of time, and peak oil demand is not going to be before 2030, even if you have a very fast speed of electric vehicles. So,
before I ask you the last question, I have only 2 minutes. We've got two really great experts on oil prices and markets here on the platform, among the best in the world. We have limited time, but I'll just allow one person to ask a question to them. One question. Any question here? Yes, please. Mr. Anand.
One perspective of Asia, which clearly we're talking about the demand demographics, the challenge of penetration, the challenge of kind of reaching up to a situation where you find that alternate gets very, very expensive. And as opposed to something similar, something which is very different experience that you have from your, producing state, where I'm told, Ashok just tells me that substantial amount of energy actually comes through hydro. And so then the experience of the transition of energy, is much faster, and even for the population dynamics. So how do you see the two worlds merging? Because on one end, you have a very strong perspective which comes from Europe about renewables, about the shifts and the experiences that you have. And on the other hand, you have the other part of the economy which is still having a substantial lag. And to fast track themselves, so obviously we'll need fuel and we'll need oil to be that critical pivot to kind of drive themselves on.
Just one reason for the energy transition is the climate perspective. But what people tend to forget, is that all these investments, all the shifts has two sides. It's the capital investment upfront, and then it's the operational expenses. And both has a carbon footprint. And if you calculate, actually if you do the transition too fast, and that you scrap usable assets, actually the carbon footprint is worse. So you have to have a natural kind of life cycle perspective on this. And most of the machinery in the consuming oil has an average lifetime of 20 years. Actually, cars somewhat lower, but ships and airplanes much longer, actually, especially airplanes, you know. So you are not, it's impossible, and it would even be a worse climate footprint if you were too quick in the transition. And what is actually, but the positive news is that solar, and by the way, it's no meaning to shift to electric vehicles if you have coal-fired power plants. Again, the carbon footprint is worse. So you have to go hand in hand with changing the electricity to the renewables, hand in hand with changing the car fleet to electric vehicles. And this will take 20 to 30 years. In China, in India, in Indonesia, maybe 30 to 40 years. In Europe and in Norway, it could be more than 5 to 15 years. So I think in 15 years, you will struggle to find a gasoline car in Norway, but most of the cars in India will still be gasoline cars. But in 40 years, I think the transition has happened. But you have to have a holistic plan where also the capital element is included in this.
I think Norway has a policy that all domestic flights will be electric flights within 20 years, is it? And that brings us back to a first world problem.
Still, they have brought the Prime Minister up in an electric plane, at least,
yes.
just to
talk. But I mean, I think the point is, and the reason that Oslo has traffic jams made up exclusively of electric vehicles is because the tax penalty on a non-electric vehicle means that you know, Elon Musk would be nothing without Norway. But let's bring it back to dealing with you know, what you talk about as the developing world problem. I don't personally like the third world descriptor. We'll be releasing a paper in the next couple of months that is the culmination of 2 years of work on precisely this issue, which is that developing economies, when they have a choice between welfare and development and poverty eradication of today's generation versus avoiding costs for future generations, they always choose, and rightly always choose, the current generation. Whatever anyone said earlier today, I'm sorry, the numbers disagree. Renewable energy is not yet cheaper as a provision of electricity into an electric grid, except in one or two very specific circumstances. Central station power distributed over a grid and with seasonal storage requirements, fossil fuels the only cost-effective means, unless you have huge amounts of hydro. And Germany, fortunately, has huge amounts of hydro. It just happens to be in Norway rather than in Germany. And it's a great business for Norway, being Germany's battery. But the point is that we are on the wrong path in terms of dealing with climate, because we're going down a path using technologies and policies that assume that even developing economies will pay the cost of carbon avoided. And no developing economy has shown itself willing to do that to date. It hasn't done it in history, and it's not showing any signs of wanting to do in the future. We need to be investing far more money in technology improvements, taking us onto a different path. We know the cost curve of solar PV, and we know the cost curve of batteries. It doesn't take us to a point where we have organic adoption of renewables when you take away the rent within fossil fuels. So that transition isn't on track to happen. That's the thing we should be talking about.
David, just last question before I'll let you go both. But just one, you made a remark about, you know, downtown Oslo, where they're just basically pushing all the petrol and diesel car out, and only EVs, or even EVs are not being allowed, if I remember right. But, so it's an interesting remark what you made. What's the last question? Sorry, you have a quick question?
A quick question, a very specific one. My question is to Mr. David Hobbs. I'm from the car industry. When we talk about lithium-ion technology, we are told that when lithium will match about $70 per kilowatt hour, which is the petroleum equivalent of energy carrying capacity, energy carrying cost, then electric will take over. Now my question is that $70 per kilowatt hour a static figure, or with demand and supply, the oil volumes coming down, the price will shift down and it's a moving target?
So here's the simple answer. Imagine a world, let's imagine that the IEA's 2-degree case is right and that oil demand is only $50 a barrel, 50 million barrels a day. What do we think the oil price is going to be? Is there anyone who thinks that even OPEC could control the oil price to be above $20 a barrel if global demand was 50 million barrels a day? What do we think it takes to, and that's what it would take to stop new capacity being built of oil. If we want to limit demand to less than 50 million barrels a day, we need oil prices more than $300 a barrel. That gap is going to be policy. It's going to be taxation, or it's going to be mandates. It's going to be something that costs $270 a barrel. And that's just not economically sustainable, because it costs much less than that to decarbonize oil, probably between $10 and $20 a barrel, depending on technology innovation. So we know that that world isn't going to exist. It exists only in the minds of ideology.
David, it's interesting to hear what you say about OPEC and, the whole system. But just a last question before I invite, Ray to deliver his presentation on the US India relations. Just last, and I'm sure everyone in the room would like to hear from you two gentlemen. Oil prices 2019, can you predict? In markets, I know.
The simple answer to that is no, because your question was, can I predict? I'm going to tell you that they will, from where they are today, they will probably go up and then go down and then back to being the same, but not necessarily in that order.
Now, this is a good one. You should have been a diplomat.
Okay.
No, but let me rephrase the question. Crude oil prices on the 1st of April 2019. First of all, I'm not talking about, the joke, but seriously. Crude oil prices, 1st of April 2019, David.
Narendra.
One line answer.
If I knew, I wouldn't be here. I mean, the answer is it'll be whatever the market. I know what I could buy oil on the 1st of April 2019 for if I buy it today. That's the futures price. I have no idea. Nobody has any idea what it's going to be. And if anyone says that they do and they're still working for a living, then they're lying.
Okay. What about crude oil prices? When do you think crude is going to touch $100 per barrel? Brent.
Sometime in the next 10 years, and it'll probably be during the next...
David,
come
on.
No, but Narendra, let me give you... but this is a very serious point. I gave a speech in 2003 in which I was asked precisely that question in a similar sort of setting, and I said, well, we can say one thing for sure. Whenever you say you can say one thing for sure, the red light should be flashing in your mind. I said the price is going to be somewhere between, for the next decade, it's going to be somewhere between $10 and $100 a barrel. And it didn't take me more than 2 years to be wrong. Okay?
But you see, you ask this question, whether you ask this question to Mr. Jumma or Khalid Al-Faleh, they all give the same answer. We don't know.
Well, that's partly, it's not because I give them the same answer, but when they ask me that, I give them the same answer I just gave you.
All right. Jaran.
No,
Crude oil prices 1st of April 2019.
No, I think as a soldier, we will have a dampening of the cycle due to a lot of efforts to drill infill wells in OPEC and Russia. So 83 is maybe a number.
$83 per barrel?
Yeah, just to stick out my neck and say something.
Okay.
But of course we see a quite tight market, since the Permian oil has not yet arrived to the market in April next year. April 2020, a lot of the Permian oil is coming, No. But then we have the IMO regulations that I talked about.
One number.
I said so.
Okay.
Yeah.
Could I just...
You can keep his number, phone number, and
Good.
email ID. Thank you.